Russia's Black Sea Fleet is finished, not weakened, not bruised, not pushed back. Finished. The flagship is on the seabed. The submarine fleet has been hunted inside what was supposed to be the safest harbor on the Russian coast. The headquarters in Sevastopol has burned twice. The command staff has fled to Novorossiysk, and as of last week, even that sanctuary has been violated by a weapon that did not exist 18 months ago, a Ukrainian underwater drone that crawled into a defended Russian harbor and struck a Kilo-class submarine while it was tied to the pier. Let that sink in for a moment. A country with no navy has destroyed roughly one-third of the combat assets of one of the four operational fleets of the Russian Federation. The Ukrainian Ministry of Defense's own assessment, published earlier this year, places destroyed Black Sea Fleet combat assets at approximately 30%. The United States Naval Institute, writing in proceedings in September, used the same figure. Britain's former defense secretary said Ukraine destroyed 20% of the fleet in 4 months. 2 years later, that number has compounded into something the Russian Navy has not experienced since the Tsushima disaster of 1905. This is not a story about clever drone tricks. This is not a story about Crimea. This is a case study in what happens when a Navy built around 20th century survivability assumptions collides with a 21st century distributed kill chain. What you are witnessing is the operational obsolescence of the surface combatant as the centerpiece of regional sea power. And before this analysis is finished, you will understand not just what happened to Russia's Black Sea Fleet, you will understand why it was always going to happen and why the lesson is now being studied in Beijing, in Taipei, in Manila, and inside every NATO naval staff that can read a map. Pull the lens back. Rewind to February of 2022. On the morning the full-scale invasion began, the Black Sea Fleet was, on paper, the unchallenged maritime power of the basin. It had a guided missile cruiser as its flagship, the Imagery, Yaminki Inchafring Foim, Yastakshananger and Koskrishat the Moskva, 11,400 tons, designed in the Soviet era to kill American carrier battle groups. It had 13 amphibious landing ships, 6 of them concentrated in the Black Sea. It had a submarine brigade of 6 diesel-electric Kilo-class boats modernized to carry Kaliber cruise missiles. It had frigates, corvettes, missile boats, minesweepers, and a support train. It had a deep-water fortress at Sevastopol, an air arm at Saki, a coastal air defense network anchored on S-400 batteries, and the closure of the Bosphorus under the Montreux Convention, which meant no Western reinforcements could enter the basin to challenge it. Ukraine in the same hour had effectively zero navy. Its single frigate, the Hetman Sehedokny, was scuttled and dry docked to prevent capture. That was the entire Ukrainian surface fleet on day one, 0 versus 74. That was the correlation of forces at sea on the 24th of February 2022. The Russian assumption that flowed from this was not unreasonable. It was, in fact, the same assumption that every traditional naval planner in the world would have made. The assumption was this: a state without a navy cannot contest the sea. Therefore, sea control in the Black Sea was a settled question. Therefore, the fleet's primary mission would shift from combat to projection, and the Fiaspri Akprin Saikri Rafti, a Refori, and the Arkshan Projeti, amphibious landing threats against Odessa, cruise missile strikes against Ukrainian infrastructure, and blockade of Ukrainian grain exports. The fleet would be a hammer, not a target. This assumption was not merely wrong. It was wrong in the most dangerous way an assumption can be wrong. It was the kind of assumption that organizes your entire force posture, your basing decisions, your training cycles, and your air defense priorities around a threat model that no longer exists. And when the real threat model arrived, the fleet was not configured to recognize it, let alone defeat it. What happens next changes everything, because the first crack in the Russian assumption came not from a Ukrainian warship, but from a piece of coastal infrastructure that the Russian Navy had effectively dismissed. On the 13th of April 2022, the Moskva, and the flagship of the Black Sea Fleet, the namesake of the Russian capital, the most symbolically important warship in the Russian Navy, was struck by 2 Ukrainian-designed Neptune anti-ship cruise missiles fired from a truck-mounted launcher on the Odessa coast. The Moskva burned through the night. By morning, she had capsized and gone down in roughly 2,000 meters of water, the largest warship sunk in combat since the Falklands War, the first flagship lost by any navy in over 40 years, and the first piece of evidence that the Black Sea Fleet's air defense picture, the thing that was supposed to make it survivable, was broken. Let me walk you through what this actually means at the strategic level. The Moskva was not just a ship. She was the air defense umbrella for the entire surface action group. Her S-300F naval missile system was supposed to detect, track, and engage exactly the kind of low-flying subsonic anti-ship missile that killed her. The fact that two Neptunes, a weapon Russian intelligence had assessed as immature and not in serial production, penetrated that umbrella and struck the flagship herself, told you something the Russian Navy did not want to hear. It told you that the sensor-to-shooter loop on Russia's premier air defense platform did not work against the threat it was specifically designed to defeat. And if it did not work on the Moskva, it did not work on any other surface combatant in the fleet because she had the best system aboard. That was milestone one. It exposed the air defense assumption. Russia's response was not to redesign the fleet. Russia's response was to pull the fleet back, closer to Crimea, and rely on shore-based S-400s to provide the umbrella that the ships themselves could no longer provide. In other words, Russia chose to make its fleet a static asset tethered to a fixed defensive perimeter. And the moment you make a fleet static, you have already lost half of what makes a fleet useful. And it gets even more serious from here, because Milestone 2 arrived from a direction the Russian Navy had not seriously planned for at all: the maritime drone, the unmanned surface vessel, the kamikaze sea drone. Ukraine, with no shipyards capable of building combatants and no time to build them even if it had, did what insurgent navies have always done. It found an asymmetric weapon and built it at scale. The Sea Baby, developed by the Security Service of Ukraine. The Magura V5, developed by military intelligence. Hulls of fiberglass and composite, lengths of 5 to 6 meters, payloads of 300 to 800 kilograms of high explosive, ranges measured in hundreds of kilometers, guidance via Starlink and satellite uplink, costs in the low six figures of dollars per unit. Now compare that to what they hunt. A Kilo-class submarine costs roughly $300 million to replace. A Rapucha-class landing ship, roughly $150 million. A Taranto-class missile corvette, roughly $75 million. The exchange ratio is not unfavorable to Ukraine. It is grotesquely favorable. We are watching in real time the most lopsided cost imposition campaign in modern naval history. The strikes that followed read like a roll call of Russian naval embarrassment. The Saratov, a large landing ship destroyed at Berdyansk by ballistic missile. The Ivanovets, a Taranto 3 missile boat, sunk on the 1st of February 2024 by a swarm of 6 Magura 5-5 drones in waters near Lake Donoslav. Roughly 40 crew killed. The Caesar Kunikov, a Rapucha-class landing ship, sunk on the 14th of February 2024 south of Yalta by another Magura strike. The Sergei Kotov, a brand new Bykov-class patrol ship commissioned in 2022, sunk in March 2024 near the Kerch Strait. 7 killed. The Rostov-on-Don, a Kilo-class submarine struck in dry dock in Sevastopol in September 2023 by Storm Shadow cruise missiles, effectively a total loss. The Minsk, a large landing ship, struck the same night and gutted. Pull the lens back. This matters enormously because if you sequence those losses against the Russian response, you see the shape of structural failure. After every major loss, the Russian Navy did not adapt the threat model. It adapted the location. It pulled ships from Sevastopol to Feodosia, from Feodosia to Novorossiysk, from Novorossiysk to anchorages even further east. By the autumn of 2023, the operational core of the Black Sea Fleet had effectively abandoned Crimea, the very reason the fleet existed in its current form. By September of 2024, even the Novorossiysk basing posture was becoming untenable, with Ukrainian strikes reaching the harbor itself. The Ukrainian Military Intelligence Directorate, the GUR, has published the cumulative tally. Russia has lost approximately 15 large warships in the Black Sea and Azov theaters. The exact composition varies by counting methodology, but it includes a cruiser, multiple landing ships, missile corvettes, patrol ships, minesweepers, and now, as of December 2025, a submarine struck inside its own pen. This is the moment the Russian assumption collapsed completely, because what mainstream framing keeps missing, the framing you see in cable news, the framing you see in casual analysis, you can see in there she, NC, is the idea that this is simply about clever Ukrainian drones. It is not. The drones are the symptom. The disease is doctrinal. Let me explain what I mean. The Russian Navy, as inherited from the Soviet Navy, was built around three operational concepts. First, layered air defense anchored on the flagship. Second, sea denial through submarine and missile boat operations. Third, amphibious projection through dedicated landing ship squadrons. All three concepts assumed that the threat would come from above the water, from above sea level, and from a peer competitor operating a similar order of battle. None of those three concepts assumed that the threat would come from below the waterline, from a non-state-grade industrial base, and at a per-unit cost the defender could not match in interception. The hidden military variable here is the cost per engagement of the defensive system. A Russian Pantsir M close-in defense system fires a missile that costs several $100,000 per round. A Ukrainian sea drone costs roughly $250,000 per unit. When you are firing a more expensive interceptor at a cheaper attacker, and you must achieve a near-perfect interception rate to remain operational, you are losing the war before the first shot is fired. This is the same problem that the Houthis exposed in the Red Sea against American destroyers, and it is the same problem that any defender will face anywhere that the offensive cost curve has collapsed faster than the defensive cost curve. And the larger pattern this confirms is the one that should be keeping every naval staff in the world awake at night. The era of the symbolic capital ship as the organizing principle of regional sea power is over. Not over in 2050, over now. The Black Sea Fleet did not lose because its crews were incompetent. And though many were. It did not lose because its equipment was old, though much of it was. It lost because the entire concept of a concentrated, harbor-based, surface combatant-centric fleet is no longer survivable against a distributed, low-cost, software-defined kill chain. Now pull the lens further back because the consequences cascade well past the waterline. Consider the industrial dimension. Russian shipbuilding capacity for major surface combatants is concentrated in St. Petersburg and the Kola Peninsula. Replacement of a Kilo-class submarine takes roughly 5 to 7 years from keel laying to commissioning under normal conditions. Replacement of a Rapucha-class landing ship is essentially impossible. In fact, the the class has been out of production since the late Soviet period. Replacement of a Slava-class cruiser like the Moskva is, in practical terms, off the table. Russia is not regenerating the Black Sea Fleet. Russia is presiding over its liquidation. Consider the geographic dimension. The Montreux Convention closes the Bosphorus to combatant transit in wartime. That means Russia cannot reinforce the Black Sea Fleet from the Northern Fleet or the Pacific Fleet. Whatever was there on the 24th of February 2022 is, minus losses, all that will ever be there for the duration of this war. The fleet is a closed system, and in a closed system under sustained attrition, the math is unforgiving. Consider the economic dimension. The Black Sea Fleet's secondary mission, the blockade of Ukrainian grain exports, has effectively collapsed. Ukraine reopened a unilateral grain corridor in the autumn of 2023 by simply daring the Russian Navy to interfere. The Russian Navy did not interfere because it could not afford the losses. Ukrainian grain exports through the corridor have since exceeded pre-war volumes in some months. That is a state-level economic consequence directly attributable to the destruction of Russian sea control. The fleet that was supposed to strangle Ukraine's economy has instead surrendered the economic chokehold without firing a meaningful shot. Consider the shadow fleet dimension. As of the last several weeks, Ukrainian naval drones have struck Russian shadow fleet tankers, the vessels Moscow uses to evade Western oil sanctions, inside the Black Sea itself. The Kairos and the Virat, two such tankers, were struck in late November. This is a fundamentally new escalation because it extends Ukrainian sea denial from military targets to the maritime supply line that funds the Russian war economy. The fleet that cannot protect its own warships cannot protect its commerce either, and once commerce becomes contested, the strategic calculus of the war shifts again. This is the moment we reach the climactic operation, the one that crystallizes everything that has come before. On the 15th of December 2025, the Security Service of Ukraine announced the deployment of a weapon called the Subsea Baby, an underwater unmanned vehicle, an attack UUV, a true submersible drone. Wenchi Sa-in-Chi. This vehicle, operating in the harbor of Novorossiysk, not Sevastopol, not Crimea, but on the Russian mainland coast east of the Kerch Strait, struck a Project 636.3 Varshavianka-class submarine, the export designation of which is the improved Kilo. The submarine was disabled. According to Ukrainian Navy statements, the boat is out of operational service. According to independent assessments published in European defense journals the same week, the strike represents the first known instance in history of an unmanned underwater vehicle successfully engaging a submarine in its own home port. Read that sentence again because the precedent is enormous. The submarine, the platform that has been the gold standard of survivability in naval warfare since 1945, the platform whose entire value proposition is that it cannot be found, has been hunted in harbor by a robot. The sanctuary is gone. The last hiding place is gone. The doctrinal assumption that a submarine in its own protected anchorage is safe has been broken in front of the entire world. And it was broken inside Russian territorial waters, not in disputed Crimea, not in international waters. In Novorossiysk, on the Russian Federation's recognized sovereign coast, protected by layered Russian harbor defenses, by Russian coastal patrols, by Russian submarine nets, by the entire Russian harbor security apparatus. None of it worked. A Ukrainian underwater drone launched from a covert platform navigated into the harbor and detonated against the hull of a $300 million submarine. The Russian Navy now has nowhere to put its fleet. Sevastopol is unsafe. Feodosia is unsafe. Novorossiysk is unsafe. The submarine pens are unsafe. The dry docks are unsafe. The piers are unsafe. There is no remaining stretch of the Russian Black Sea coast where a major combatant can be considered survivable against the current Ukrainian threat envelope. That is what it means to say the fleet is finished. It is not that every ship has been sunk. It is that no surviving ship has a safe place to operate from. Pull the lens back one final time. The real question is not what happens to the Black Sea Fleet. The Black Sea Fleet is a settled matter. The real question is what every other navy in the world does with this lesson, because the People's Liberation Army Navy is watching. The lesson they are taking from this is not the obvious one. The obvious lesson is that small drones beat big ships. That is the surface lesson. The deeper lesson, the one being studied in classified PLA assessments and in U.S. Indo-Pacific Command war games right now, is that a peer competitor with no navy can deny sea control to a regional naval power if it has access to commercial-grade composites, commercial-grade satellite communications, commercial-grade autonomy software, and the political will to absorb attrition. Substitute Taiwan for Ukraine. Substitute the Taiwan Strait for the Black Sea. Substitute the East Sea Fleet for the Black Sea Fleet. The geometry of the problem rhymes, and the lesson is not just defensive. It is offensive. The United States Navy, the Royal Navy, the French Navy, the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force, every Western Navy that has built its order of battle around expensive manned multi-mission surface combatants, is now confronting a doctrinal question that did not exist 5 years ago. If a country with no navy can destroy 30% of a peer fleet in 3 years using $10 million production lines, what does that imply for the survivability of a $1.8 billion Arleigh Burke destroyer in a contested littoral? What does it imply for the $11 billion Ford-class aircraft carrier in the South China Sea? What does it imply for the basing of British amphibious ships or French frigates in the Mediterranean against a future hostile actor with comparable capabilities? The verdict is this: the destruction of the Black Sea Fleet is the most important naval event since the end of the Cold War. It is the moment at which the surface fleet, as the organizing principle of regional sea power, lost its claim to centrality. Future historians will not write about this as a Ukrainian victory, though it is one. They will write about it as the inflection point at which the cost curves of offense and defense diverged so sharply that the entire architecture of 20th century navalism became unsustainable. Russia, in this telling, is the unfortunate test case. The Russian Navy did not lose because Russia is uniquely incompetent. The Russian Navy lost because it was the first major fleet placed under sustained attack by an industrially serious adversary using the new generation of weapons, and because its doctrine, its basing, its air defense concept, and its political leadership were all calibrated to a war that no longer exists. Any Navy in the world that does not internalize this lesson quickly, ruthlessly, and at the expense of cherished platforms and cherished careers, mine will eventually find itself in the same position. History will record that Russia entered this war with the strongest navy in the Black Sea basin and the third largest navy in the world, and that within 3 years it had been driven out of its own home waters by an adversary that did not possess a single warship on the day the war began. The fleet that bombarded Odessa in 1854, the fleet that fought at Sinop, the fleet that the Soviets rebuilt at enormous cost, the fleet that Putin spent a quarter century reconstituting as the symbol of Russian Mediterranean power. Finished, not by another fleet, by drones, missiles, and a doctrinal adversary that understood the future of naval warfare better than the navy it was fighting. The strategic forecast from here is straightforward and grave. Russia will not regenerate the Black Sea Fleet inside this decade. The replacement timelines, the sanctioned industrial base, and the closed Bosphorus all guarantee that. Ukraine will continue to push the threat envelope eastward against shadow fleet tankers, against submarine pens, against the Kerch Bridge, against the coastal infrastructure that supports what remains of Russian maritime activity. NATO navies will quietly accelerate their unmanned surface and underwater programs while publicly understating how much of their own current force structure is now obsolete. And the Pacific Theater will spend the next several years absorbing this lesson in classified studies that the public will not see for a decade. The Black Sea Fleet is finished. The questions that remain are bigger. Which navy is next to learn this lesson the hard way? Which surface combatant currently in commission will be the last of its line? And which power watching all of this is right now building the sea drones that will rewrite the next theater? Those questions do not have simple answers. They will be answered fleet by fleet, harbor by harbor in the years ahead, and we will be here when they are. If this analysis was valuable to you, subscribe to the channel. Every subscriber moves us closer to the goal of building the most clear-eyed military analysis community on this platform, and the work only continues because you are watching. Stay with us. The next update is already taking shape.